Hey, Nick Whitfield here, and I'm here to discuss the Border Trilogy Part 3 What Remains podcast. It follows a anthropologist named Jason DeLeon in possibly the worst field trip I've ever heard of, where he takes some students into the Sonoran Desert in southern Arizona, and they're going to examine pig carcasses that have been left in the desert to decompose. So while they're there, they actually come across the body of a migrant. Uh, the podcast goes into very graphic details in describing the body, in the decomposition, and it's very graphic, even for someone who's heard a lot of things. It talks about the body emitting a constant hissing as the gases leave, like the intestinal parts, which was bad. But the one thing that really kind of brought it home to me, and oddly enough, is that they described the body as having a hair scrunchie on her wrist. And that seemed to be very humanizing. Instead of describing a corpse, that was more kind of describing a person, that she was wearing stretch pants and tennis shoes and a scrunchie. It seemed like she was going to the gym instead of trying to cross an international border. So anyway, so they find the body and they call the cops, and it takes them 5 hours to get there, just from the fact that it's so far in the desert, which was interesting. But anyway, so they find the body, and he decides that, and when I say him, Jason DeLeon wants to know more about it. So he contacts a girl named Robin Renicky that works at the Calabria Center of Human Rights, and they deal with migrants and missing people and things like that. So she talks to a couple countries. She ends up talking to the Ecuadorian consulate, and they're looking for missing people. So the medical examiner that they're dealing with can, basically say, she was a female from 30 to 35. So they get some information, and they find out that the girl was a 31-year-old Maricela Angapola, and that she had left Ecuador a couple months earlier in this large caravan. The way they kind of found out about her and who that she was is that someone had actually called the consulate and had said that he had traveled in a large group across the border and had left two people behind, an older guy and this younger woman from Ecuador. So that's kind of how that also got the ball rolling. Well, De Leon is very interested in the story, wants to know more details, wants to talk to the family. So through a whole bunch of, questions and chasing tails and stuff like that, they find that she actually has relatives in Queens, New York. So they find her brother-in-law, Fernando, and tell him about it. And this is where the story kind of moves away from her and about his experience. He had actually crossed the border very similar to the way she did 10 years earlier. And she called him and said that her and her husband wanted to cross the border. She was working in a factory making counterfeit jeans, and he was selling sodas in a village, and they just weren't making enough money to get their kids a good education. So their only option was to try to cross the border. And this is in Ecuador, mind you, so it's not just across the border. So Fernando goes on and tells the story of how he crossed. And it was interesting. It started out that he had to take a $12,000 loan out on his grandfather's property, which I thought was interesting because that kind of goes against the narrative that the only people that wanted to cross were complete, total, abject poverty. I don't know anything about the Mexican real estate, or the Ecuadorian real estate, but $12,000 worth of land sounds like a lot. So he could have been middle lower class, but that just kind of stood out. So anyway, he's only 17. So he decides to cross the border, and he's going to go with his aunt. They give the money to the coyotes, who are the human smugglers, And the smugglers say it's only going to take about 15 days. Well, in actuality, it takes about 3 months. And instead of just simple car rides to the border that they were promised, they have to do a lot of trekking through the mountains and the trunks of taxis and buses, and just a terrible trip. And at the end of the terrible trip was the worst part. They end up in Mexico, and they end up on this ranch in Mexico, and they said with about 250 other people that were trying to cross the border. And they said that they were from different countries, which kind of explains how open the border is, that they were mentioning that they were Chinese, and that people trying to enter the U.S. actually got into Mexico first, and that's how they were crossing over. So he's in this ranch being held basically at gunpoint with these people. And, there's some abuse, and they say at some point, he's brought out, and to prevent his aunt from being assaulted, he ends up going through a bunch of sexual assaults and things like that, which is just terrible. But then they talk about that they finally escape. They make it to the border, or they make it to the border where they're arrested by Border Patrol. He makes bail, he jumps bail, he ends up just kind of disappearing into the population and ends up in Queens. There where, he finds a job, starts being successful enough. So years later, he gets a phone call from this Maricela, and her husband want to cross the border because their kids, aren't getting good education, and she wants to cross. And he tells her this story of how bad it was for him. And she basically says, I'm prepared to do it. I can do anything. I don't have a choice. But unfortunately, they didn't have enough money for both of them to cross. So they decided that she would go first and he would follow, which it's weird that they wouldn't stay together being married. I wouldn't let my wife do anything. That's weird. So she crosses the border, and she has this, meets this terrible death in the deserts of Arizona. But the weird part is then this De Leon, this anthropologist, he gets a phone call several months later from another member of Maricela's family saying that her cousin is now missing. And he talks to them, and he makes a commitment that he's going to try to find this cousin just the way he found Maricela. So the story ends with him working drones and scanning the same area where she was found dead, her brother-in-law traveled through, and now their cousin's missing. So it shows that it's generational, that it's just nonstop, and that it was all within this one family, which it's terrible, terrible story. But, it ends with him just trying to find closure for other members of the family, just like he did for them. So that's the story. It was very graphic. It was very tragic. And it brought to light some of the problems that we've had on the border forever. This incident actually happened in 2012. A lot of people think that this is more of a recent Trump-type problem, but it's been going on forever. It's just happened to have spotlight shown on it lately. So that's my presentation. I enjoyed it. This is the first time I videotaped myself since probably 1983 on a skateboard ramp. So thank you, and I hope you enjoyed it.